Hi everybody, here we are again as I go through Lee Strobel's The Case for Christ, one chapter at a time from an atheist perspective, and I'm about to start chapter 10, The Fingerprint Evidence. Did Jesus and Jesus alone match the identity of the Messiah? Strobel's opening anecdote for chapter 10, and by the way, the theme of chapter 10 is anecdote. Filled with anecdote is chapter 10. He tells the Thomas Jennings story. Thomas Jennings was the first man convicted of murder in the United States on the basis of fingerprint evidence. He was convicted of killing a man largely on the basis of him leaving a handprint on wet paint at the crime scene, which positively placed him at the scene. And as a result of that murder, which took place in 1910, he was convicted and hanged in 1912. And that's right, 2012 is the centennial of fingerprint evidence being used to hang people in the USA. So, how'd that one get by us? Strobel suggests that the fingerprints that we need to match up to determine whether or not Jesus was the Messiah are the life of Jesus as we find it in the Gospels and the prophecies, the messianic prophecies found in the Old Testament. If we can compare those two patterns and they match. In other words, if the back of the Bible matches the front of the Bible is true. Who can argue with logic like that? So we come to the 9th interview, and it is Louis S. Lapidus, Master of Divinity, Master of Theology. I want to note that Louis Lapidus is the first and only expert interviewed in the Case for Christ who does not hold a doctorate. And I just want to make sure to point that out because of Strobel's tendency, which we discussed in the previous video, to demean colleges and universities and the people who teach at them, except of course for those who hold Strobel's religious viewpoints. Louis S. Lapidus holds a bachelor's degree in theology from Dallas Baptist University, a Master of Divinity and a Master of Theology in Old Testament and Semitics from Talbot Theological Seminary, and he is a teacher in the Bible department at Biola University. Does Biola University have a department other than the Bible department? Lapidus is Jewish, originally from Newark, New Jersey. He converted to Christianity as an adult after being raised as a Jew. He became a pastor and now has been active at the time he's interviewing with Strobel, has been active in talking to Jewish college students about Jesus. Strobel says, quote, "I didn't want to begin by debating biblical nuances. Instead, I started by inviting Lapidus to tell me the story of his spiritual journey." And Jesus Christ, does Lapidus ever avail himself of that invitation? The majority of the chapter is devoted to the story of Lapidus's spiritual journey from Judaism to Christianity. Strobel devotes 5 sections of this chapter to relating to us Lapidus's conversion in just reverent detail. And those 5 sections of this chapter are titled A Spiritual Quest Begins, I Can't Believe in Jesus, Pierced for Our Transgressions, The Jewishness of Jesus, and Epiphany in the Desert. And the reason I list them all at once like that, I'm sort of breaking from my usual format for this chapter because I'm going to just go ahead and summarize his entire anecdote about his personal spiritual journey here up front, hopefully in short order, because it's filled with irrelevant personal details that have nothing to do with making the case for Christ. And it amounts basically to just emotionally manipulative filler to pad out what must have been a pretty slim chapter on the messianic prophecies. So here we go, Lapidus' story very quickly. Lapidus was raised in a Jewish family, although the faith was never stressed as anything particularly important except during the high holy days when the family would attend the local Orthodox synagogue for the only time during the year. When Strobel asks what he was taught by his parents about the Messiah, Lapidus, to the utter astonishment of Strobel, replies that the subject never came up. And he says, quote, "Never," Lapidus reiterated. "I don't even remember it being an issue in Hebrew school." Jesus, Lapidus says, was mentioned only derogatorily, which would seem to contradict his claim just a few seconds ago that the Messiah was never discussed, since it's strange to think of the most famous example of a false Messiah being discussed by Jews in any other context, but maybe that's not true. What do I know? Maybe they had some other reason to disparage Jesus. Lapidus got his image of Jesus in the absence of any religious instruction about Jesus from his synagogue, from Catholic iconography, from passing by Catholic churches and seeing paintings and stained glass windows and statuary of Jesus, the crucified Christ, the crown of thorns, etc. And he was cautioned as a child by his parents and his Jewish teachers to be wary of Gentiles, since it was the Gentiles who were the source of anti-Semitism. He also eventually developed negative attitudes toward Christians and assumed before he read it that the New Testament was a how-to manual for oppressing and massacring Jews. It's actually a how-to manual for oppressing women. Quote, "I shook my head, saddened at the thought of how many other Jewish children have grown up thinking of Christians as their enemies," says Lee Strobel. But I have to wonder, Lee, are you sad at the thought of the 2,000 years of organized Christian-led persecution that gave those Jewish children a reason to think of Christians as their enemies? Or are you sad that their Jewish parents and teachers told them about all that, thus making it more difficult for people like you to convince them to relinquish their superstition in favor of yours? Lapidus' parents divorced when he was 17, and he underwent a spiritual crisis beginning around this time. He eventually rebelled against Judaism and against Western religion in general. He was drafted into the military and was sent to Vietnam in 1967. Saw some pretty heavy shit over there, as you might imagine. Experienced some anti-Semitism firsthand from his comrades in the military, some of whom even once burned a cross for his benefit. So he comes home from Nam. He flirts with Buddhism. He gets depressed. He considers suicide. He smokes a lot of weed. He tries LSD. And eventually he gets into a discussion with a street preacher on the Sunset Strip who had chained himself to an 8-foot cross to protest being evicted from his storefront ministry. And he argues with this street preacher and with some of the Christians who have gathered around to support him. And one of them points out to Lapidus that Jesus, like Lapidus himself, was Jewish. And someone mentions the Old Testament messianic prophecies. Lapidus is handed a Bible by one of them and is encouraged to read the Old Testament, the Jewish parts, and to ask the God that he knows from Judaism, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, to show him whether or not Jesus is truly the Messiah. So Lapidus, with his brain I would assume still severely addled from just the insane amount of drugs he was doing, goes home and starts reading the Bible. And he starts encountering these messianic prophecies almost immediately, and he is, of course, most impressed by the lengthy passage in Isaiah 53. I'm not going to quote the whole thing because it just goes on forever, but it's the bit that includes the lines like, "He was despised and rejected by men, he was pierced for our transgressions," the whole lengthy passage in Isaiah 53 that Christians usually quote as like the big messianic prophecy in the Old Testament. Strobel says, quote, "Instantly, Lapidus recognized the portrait. This was Jesus of Nazareth." Now he was beginning to understand the paintings he had seen in the Catholic churches he had passed as a child. Yes, Louis Lapidus, whose understanding of Jesus was virtually non-existent by his own admission, instantly recognized that Isaiah 53 had to be about Jesus. So Lapidus starts reading the New Testament after he gets through the Old Testament, and he's struck by how clearly, obviously, identifiably Jewish Jesus and many of the other central figures of the Gospels are. He detects all kinds of references to Jewish scriptures, and he's just flabbergasted by the book of Acts, where he sees the Jewish followers of Jesus bringing the gospel to the Gentiles, which he notices is in direct opposition, stark contrast to today when things are the other way around, with Gentiles continually trying to bring the gospel to the Jews. So Lapidus and some friends of his go out into the Mojave Desert, and he has this spiritual experience where he feels that God is speaking directly into his heart, and he feels like he's been made whole, and he undergoes this conversion to Christianity. He prays for a wife and meets a woman named Deborah, who is a fellow converted Jew, who introduces him to her church, and then they get married and they have babies, and they start their ministry, which is focused on whacking other Jews over the head with the Old Testament. The end. Okay, here are a couple of reasons why this story of Lapidus's conversion, which takes up 8 pages in this 15-page chapter, is wasted space. First, it's anecdotal evidence. Louis Lapidus is a Jewish man who was converted to Christianity by what he perceived to be these fulfilled messianic prophecies in the story of Jesus. And he is not the only one with such a story. There are many Messianic Jews and many former followers of Judaism who have converted outright to Christianity. But there are also many Jews, including scholars and rabbis, who know just as much about those prophecies as Lapidus does and don't see a convincing case for Jesus as the Messiah. Second, and I love when this happens, some of what Lapidus considers to be the most compelling evidence actually works better in making the opposite case. For instance, the wealth of Jewish details in the New Testament that Lapidus was so impressed by, the amazing number of references in the New Testament to the Old Testament, particularly to the major prophets, to Isaiah and Jeremiah, etc. Lapidus takes this as evidence that the people writing the Gospels and the New Testament accounts were familiar with these prophecies, and therefore they would have been the most informed people to judge whether or not these prophecies were being fulfilled in the person of Jesus. But it makes just as much, if not more, sense to assume that the authors of these stories that we now call the Gospels used that knowledge of the Old Testament prophecies to tell their stories accordingly and to make sure that their versions of Jesus, not necessarily the historical Jesus on which their stories were based, but their version of Jesus fulfilled those prophecies. Doesn't that make at least as much sense as how Lapidus interprets those Jewish references in the Gospels? Moving on to another section, this one is responding to objections. And here finally, more than halfway into the chapter, we get to something like the meat of this argument. Strobel asks Lapidus why more Jews aren't convinced of Jesus being the Messiah if the evidence for this is so undeniable. I think you just answered your own question there, Lee. But anyway, Lapidus's incredibly condescending and insulting response is that most of his fellow Jewish people are just too ignorant and stupid to get it. I'm paraphrasing, but that is essentially what Lapidus says. And he says, quote, "Plus, you have counter-missionary organizations that hold seminars in synagogues to try to disprove the messianic prophecies. Jewish people hear them and use them as an excuse for not exploring the prophecies personally. They'll say, the rabbi told me there's nothing to this." Yeah, it's all the Jews' fault, isn't it? So, okay, more Jews don't become Christians because they aren't critical enough of the religious instruction they receive at their synagogues. And that's bad, according to Lapidus. But what if I claimed, as I often have, that more Christians don't become atheists because they aren't critical enough of what they hear in their churches? I wonder if Lee Strobel or Louis Lapidus would like the sound of that. Oh wait, sorry, I forgot. It's different, isn't it? Because Christianity is true. Now Strobel and Lapidus, since he's finished telling us his fucking life story, address 4 alternative explanations to Jesus fulfilling the Old Testament prophecies other than him actually being the Messiah. The first one they deal with is called the coincidence argument. Maybe Jesus just fulfilled all these messianic prophecies by accident without actually being the Messiah. Lapidus says that the odds of that happening are astronomical. He says someone did the math. Strobel informs us that this someone is Peter W. Stoner. Doesn't seem important to Lapidus to tell us who it is, and figured out that the chances of someone, let's say Jesus, just by sheer chance happening to fulfill 8 of those messianic prophecies, the chances of that happening accidentally are about 1 in 100 million billion, or I think 100 quadrillion, if you prefer to state it that way. I think. I'm really, really awful at simple math and all other forms of math, so that could be wrong, but I think that's 100 quadrillion, that number. And in fact, Lapidus and Strobel both agree that the odds of these prophecies being fulfilled just by accident are so massively unlikely that for something like that to happen would essentially be impossible, and yet Jesus did it. Objection number 2, the altered gospel argument. Strobel asks if the gospel writers might not have fabricated details to make it appear that Jesus fulfilled the prophecies when in fact, in actual reality, he didn't. Lapidus disposes of this with an asinine argument that we've heard before in this book, that the people living at the time would have corrected any errors or fabrications in the stories as they were being circulated if they knew better. Right, because that's exactly how these things happen. I mean, after all, isn't this exactly what happened in the early 19th century when people who read Parson Weems' book, The Life of George Washington, corrected all the inaccuracies in that book, and as a result of that, nobody ever, to this day, has ever believed that George Washington chopped down a cherry tree and then confessed to his father by saying, "I cannot tell a lie"? That's what happened, right? Airtight, this one. Objection number 3, the intentional fulfillment argument. Might Jesus have been familiar with these messianic prophecies ahead of time and simply consciously contrived to fulfill them in order to bolster his claim to be the Messiah? Lapidus admits that this might have been possible for some of the prophecies, but not for all of them. Lapidus says, quote, "For instance, how would he control the fact that the Sanhedrin offered Judas 30 pieces of silver to betray him? How could he arrange for his ancestry, or the place of his birth, or his method of execution, or that soldiers gambled for his clothing, or that his legs remained unbroken on the cross? How would he arrange to perform miracles in front of skeptics? How would he arrange for his resurrection? And how would he arrange to be born when he was?" And of course, all of those questions can be answered quite cleanly by the altered gospel argument, which Lapidus has already addressed and, as far as I'm concerned, failed to refute. And finally, number 4, the context argument. And this says that perhaps those messianic prophecies weren't really messianic prophecies. Maybe they were just misinterpreted by Jews and scholars throughout history. Nope, says the guy who was compelled to convert to Christianity by messianic prophecies. They're all legit. And furthermore, Lapidus says, quote, "So here's my challenge to skeptics. Don't accept my word for it, but don't accept your rabbi's either. Spend the time to research it yourself. And one more thing, sincerely ask God to show you whether or not Jesus is the Messiah. That's what I did. And without any coaching, it became clear to me who fit the fingerprint of the Messiah." Again, he's talking to Jewish skeptics, not to non-religious skeptics such as myself, though it is still a silly argument. Go ask God to show you if Jesus is the Messiah. Don't most Jews believe that's exactly what God has already done? According to their belief, God inspired their scriptures. They read what their scriptures have to say about the Messiah. They look at Jesus and they say, nah, not the guy. I mean, case closed. I think a lot of Jews would say God has already answered that question for them in the form of their scripture. Here's the thing. You should have an argument. A good argument, a strong argument that works on people who don't already agree with you. Fair enough? Like, let's say that I had a kid, which I don't, thank fuck for that. But if I had a kid and my kid came up to me one day and said, "Dad, I don't believe in flying reindeer," I'd better have a better argument for that kid than, "Oh, well, why don't you just write a letter to Santa Claus and ask him if there's such a thing as flying reindeer?" That's if I wanted my kid to believe in flying reindeer. Which... Last section, everything must be fulfilled. Strobel ends this chapter by piling on the anecdotal evidence, citing several other people he knows who came from a Jewish background and eventually accepted Jesus as the Messiah. He closes by mentioning Peter Greenspan, who is a Jewish doctor who was convinced to accept Jesus by studying the Torah and the Talmud. And Strobel says, quote, "For him, the more he read books by those trying to undermine the evidence for Jesus as the Messiah, the more he saw the flaws in their arguments." Swap out the phrase Jesus as the Messiah for evolution as the best explanation for life as it exists today on Earth, or atheism as the most rational conclusion about the existence of gods, and I know exactly how the good doctor feels. Well, that's it for chapter 10. Kind of a light chapter since most of it is just anecdote and completely useless. Next, chapter 11, the medical evidence. Was Jesus' death a sham and his resurrection a hoax? That's it. Thanks for watching my review of this chapter. As always, I appreciate everybody watching and participating and finding this interesting. Not everybody would. So if you do find this interesting, that says something about you. It might not necessarily be something you would like to have said about you, but it does say something about you. And I will say that I appreciate whatever that is about you that compels you to watch this and to keep coming back to watch this series. So I will see you next time for chapter 11, and thank you as always for watching.